the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. While the Prime Minister smashed the net zero consensus yesterday, there is more work to be done. Green regulations have a stranglehold on the house building sector, and dealing with them is key to solving the housing crisis. The new House of Lords report calls on the government to do more for the faltering sector, but will its demands be met? The media mogul, Rupert Murdoch, has stepped down as the chairman of his media empire at the old age of 92, bequeathing News Corp to his son Lachlan. No wars of succession, it seems, at least for now. In a media career that has spanned 8 decades, he has certainly made friends and 1 or 2 enemies, and we'll be debating his legacy shortly. It's a great British victory, hurrah, for the stiff upper lip. A new study has suggested that Sigmund Freud has been wrong all along. Away with the oversharing and overindulging in our feelings, and revert back to good old-fashioned Stoicism. Built as an empire and saw us through 2 world wars, so can it get us through the woes of modern microaggressions? Plus, the commercial success that is sit down with Sitwell. In a time of a shoplifting crisis, bourgeois pilferers have been confessing, rather showing off actually, about what they see as harmless thieving at supermarket self-checkouts. But this is disgraceful behaviour, and it all adds up to a silent tax that supermarkets end up imposing on law-abiding customers. And these scoundrels ought to be prosecuted. State of the Nation starts now. I'll be joined by a particularly perspicacious panel this evening, contributing editor to Novara Media, Michael Walker, and the former Liz Truss advisor and Telegraph journalist, Asa Bennett. As always, you know this, I want to hear from you. It's a crucial part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's time for the news of the day with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you. Good evening. Well, the top story tonight is that the Bank of England has left its interest rate unchanged at 5.25%. Business editor Liam Halligan has more.
After 14 successive rate rises from 0.1% at the end of 2001 all the way up to 5.25%, the Bank of England has finally decided enough is enough, and inflation is now coming down, and there's no need, for now at least, to raise rates anymore. This will be a huge relief to young families with variable rate mortgages. It will be a huge relief to companies with variable rate loans. It will be a huge relief to many consumers across the country.
Well, that was Liam Halligan outside the Bank of England. And the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, says despite the bank's decision, Britain's been left worse off under the Tories.
I think there will be a sense of relief, particularly for those who are coming up to the end of their mortgage deals. But let's look at where we are in the bigger picture. because somebody coming up to remortgage their house today is looking at paying £220 more a month than they would have done if they had have remortgaged a year ago. So this is still a very challenging time for families and businesses with the cost of living crisis, which continues to bite.
Well, borrowers may start to feel the benefits of the Bank of England's announcement. Shortly after it was made, Nationwide said it'll be cutting the majority of its fixed-rate mortgages. The country's biggest building society will now offer 5- and 10-year fixed-rate mortgages of below 5% for the first time to buyers and home movers. The Prime Minister says hard-pressed families shouldn't have to pay an unaffordable price for the UK to reach net zero. The Shadow Minister for Industry and Decarbonisation, Sarah Jones, however, says the government's plan to roll back some climate policies is the wrong decision. But Rishi Sunak hit back, saying he won't proceed with plans that would punish motorists and working people.
We've been through the numbers and we're absolutely confident that we are on track to hit all our international and domestic targets, which, by the way, are world leading. And the reason I have confidence in that is because we've over-delivered on all of our carbon budgets to date. Despite everyone saying, oh, you might not hit them, we've over-delivered on them. Plus, we can see that the costs of some of these new technologies are falling far faster than people have predicted. Offshore wind is a great example of that. Cost today 70% less than we predicted in 2016.
The King has paid tribute to what he calls the indispensable relationship between the United Kingdom and France on the second day of his state visit there. His Majesty and Queen Camilla spent the afternoon visiting a flower market despite the heavy rain before heading to Notre Dame Cathedral. And earlier he became the first British monarch to speak from the Senate chamber in Paris. He celebrated the friendship and warm familiarity between the two nations, as well as unity on issues such as climate change. You're with GB News across the UK on TV, in your car, on digital radio and now on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. This is Britain's news channel.
The Prime Minister's net zero deadline delays yesterday were highly encouraging, but there's one sector where green regulations have been strangling activity, and that's in the housing sector. If people don't have places to live, society ultimately cannot function. It's one of the central jobs of government to ensure that there is a sufficient housing stock. Young people are finding it so difficult to buy homes, and if they don't, they will not become stakeholders in our society. Last year, we only built 190,000 homes. Now, that may sound a big number, but that's less than a third of the people who migrated net to the UK last year. So we're not even keeping up with the growth in our population from migration. And if the population continues to grow in this way and house building stays so low, house prices will rise inexorably and the rental market, which is already going up, will become unaffordable. This is true already in many parts of the UK where housing is now unaffordable. And to put some historic context into this, in 1968 our population was 55 million and we built in that year over 400,000 homes. Today our population is approaching 70 million and yet we're building fewer than half of the number of houses we built in the 1960s. But one of the key reasons we struggle to build as many homes as we should is because of, yes, you guessed it, green regulations. Last week, Labour peers blocked a government amendment that would have removed what is known as nutrient neutrality. Nutrient neutrality is a regulation forced on us when we were members of the EU by the European Court of Justice. And these regulations are enforced, of course, by an unaccountable quango, Natural England, which doesn't have to respond to voters, doesn't have any concern about the affordability of houses. Now, the House of Lords has come out with an excellent report which suggests that 40,000 homes a year are blocked because of this regulation. But existing developments contribute less than 5% of phosphate and nitrates in our rivers. The majority of these nutrients come from farming. But we've seen in the Netherlands that there's clearly no democratic mandate for enforcing nutrient policies on farmers. So tackling this regulation will help unleash Britain's house-building potential and solve this intergenerational crisis. And surely it should be the next chapter of the Prime Minister's intelligent net zero agenda. course, I want to hear from you. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts. You know the email by now, mailmog@gbnews.com. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Lord Moylan, the chairman of the Built Environment Committee, and Donica McCarthy, director of the Climate Media Coalition. Daniel, it's your report. You were chairman of the committee. If I understand you correctly, what your basic argument is the government has two conflicting policies. One is that it needs to build more houses, and the other is that it must try and make the environment better, and that they clash, and so we neither get more houses nor a better environment.
Well, we're certainly not getting the houses and we're not getting a better environment. But we're not saying that the objectives in themselves clash. It should be possible in an advanced civilized society both to build the houses you need and to do something to improve the environment where it's degraded and so forth. But what we're seeing, what we found to our horror, is a sort of a huge incompetence in the way in which this is both legislated for and implemented and pursued, with policies being announced and declared and put into law without any plan for how they're going to be implemented. Two departments of state, DEFRA and DLUC, as we call them, who don't seem to have a proper relationship working together. And then, as you say, unaccountable agencies like Natural England, the Environment Agency, which themselves overlap, popping up and throwing decisions into the pond, sometimes with no notice. I'll just say very quickly, what we have found is where environmental regulations have been thought out properly, consulted on, and house builders and developers have been given time to implement them, then they can incorporate them. But the nutrient neutrality thing came like a bolt from the blue, even though we'd left the European Union. We're still subject to European Union law in this respect, and it has thrown everything out in large parts of the country where there's now a moratorium on building housing because of the sewage.
And before I come to Donica, I just want to check one thing on nutrient neutrality, that the developers are being made responsible for what is already happening before they start their development. It's not just about stopping any change from their own developments.
Yeah, the pollution in our rivers, everyone would agree, is the result of decades of poor farming practices in some cases, concentrations of particular types of farms like chicken farms and piggeries in certain areas like around the River Wye, and also lack of investment in sewage disposal works to account for a larger population. These are things that will take decades to fix, but Natural England doesn't have any purchase on those legally, so it's gone for the house builders and put a moratorium on development instead.
Donica, isn't there for once actually quite a lot of agreement, even between the two of us, which would be novel, in that actually we all want to see a better environment, but that putting all of this responsibility on house builders is unreasonable, and that what Daniel's been saying about a long-term infrastructure programme to improve sewage disposal and so on is what is really needed?
What we're actually talking about here is, with the word nutrient, is actually sewage. Our rivers are filled with sewage. And there's a habitat directive that says that we should not pour more sewage into areas that are habitat protected. So we're talking not about the whole country. We're talking around 6% of the houses that's being built currently. We're talking about 6% of the stock that's being impacted by this. And we're talking about protecting the Lake District and the Norfolk roads from being filled with more sewage. I can't believe that your party is on a suicide mission, saying that the solution to our sewage-filled rivers, 90% of which are in a terrible state, is to put more sewage into them.
But we're not really talking about sewage, are we? We're talking about slurry.
No, we're talking about sewage, human sewage and slurry.
We're talking primarily about slurry because it's primarily a farming issue, and we're talking about nutrients that's put on the land to make sure that the crops grow. That's not an unreasonable thing to do, is it?
The Housing Buildings Federation has said clearly it's the result of the government inaction and neglect of sewage regulations and the agricultural runoff. The problem is not decades of lack of investment, and that's one problem. The problem is in 2015, Liz Truss has cut the Environment Agency's supervision of the sewage industry by 2/3. And if you look at the stats, the amount of sewage in our rivers went through the roof. And so that means that house builders now are not allowed to put more sewage in because of this habitat protection.
Daniel, the house builders obviously have a responsibility to connect up to a sewage network. Everyone would expect that. But surely that's actually happening. That's part of any modern development.
Yeah, but the fact is they're not allowed to build the houses in those areas, which I understand is more than 6%. But it's not the whole country. Of course, I agree with Donaghy about that. It's not the whole country that is under a ban, but there are large parts of it that are. Small and medium-sized builders are the ones suffering particularly, because if you're a builder based in Somerset, you can't suddenly say, well, there's a ban in Somerset, so I'll move to Wales. Big builders might have sites all over the country, but they don't. I just want to try and stand back from this a little bit. I mean, Donaghy and I agree there is a problem. But what everyone is defaulting to, and I'm trying not to default to, is just shouting at each other, saying, I'm right, you can't do this to the rivers, and other people are saying, I'm right, you've got to build homes, and people need homes. But what you've got to do is stand back and recognise there is a major, if you want to fix this, if you really want to fix it, and you want to put the money in to fix it, it is going to take years to fix it, however you do it. This sort of infrastructure is not built overnight. So you need a plan that people buy into. You might even accept that as part of that plan, things might even get a bit worse before they get better. But we will get there in the end. And if you don't accept a plan like that, then you're really just left with two sides shouting at each other, and the side with the most muscle will win.
Isn't that fair?
I think where there could be common ground, hopefully, is that if you look at the stats of how much sewage was in our rivers, went through the roof after Liz Truss's death.
I don't know what this Liz Truss thing is.
In 2015... Let me finish.
It's the environment.
Let me finish. I allowed you to speak. In 2015, Liz Truss slashed the supervision of the sewage industry, and secondly, she handed over the regulation, the reporting, to the sewage industry. So can we not agree it's to reverse the cuts to the money invested in supervising the water companies, and secondly, end self-regulation? Take it back in-house. Could you not agree with that? Self-regulation has been a disaster.
Because the water industry, which includes sewage, is not supervised by Liz Truss. It is supervised by an independent regulator called Ofwat. You may have criticisms of Ofwat. It's Ofwat that sets the investment programme, and they set the investment programme for the water industry.
I'm not talking about the investment programme. I'm talking about...
But this is what's reduced sewage. I mean,
it's surely the regulation. Surely self-reporting. Do you agree with self-reporting? Do you agree with self-reporting for the sewage industry?
When the water industry was in public ownership, sewage just went straight out into the sea, and there were pipes by the side of the seaside resorts. The investment that has gone in has been billions to stop all of that.
That's not true. If you look at... Well, hang on. If you look at...
It is true. Unfortunately, we are out of time. But thank you to my brilliant panellists. They're not my panellists. I've got two more coming on later. But don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. After the break, I'll be asking a socialist what he thinks of Rupert Murdoch, plus whether it's time for a purge of middle-class thievery.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
Join me, Andrew Pearce and Bev Turner, Monday to Thursday, 9:30 a.m.
Who benefits from that? Not the British public.
And on Fridays, join us, Tom Harwood
and Ellie Costello from Britain's Newsroom.
That's what you get with this show. That's fantastic.
If it's happening, we're talking about it on Britain's Newsroom.
GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the people's channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The people's channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Colin, Sunak is completely right with his stance on the unaffordable net zero idiocy. If he were to remove the UK from the ECHR and turn the boats back in the Channel, the Conservatives would walk back into another term without doubt. Charlotte, I hope you agree with me, Jacob, that the UK needs a lot more council housing. Well, we certainly need a lot more housing. The news broke earlier today that the media mogul of media moguls, really, Rupert Murdoch, was stepping down as chairman from his media empire, News Corp. The 92-year-old oversaw one of the largest media conglomerates in history in a career spanning 8 decades. Murdoch began his career in his home country of Australia in newspapers before expanding his empire into British newspapers in the late 1960s. It began with the acquisition of the News of the World and grew as he acquired The Sun as well. He then went on to start news channels like Sky News, Fox News and Sky News Australia. But in such a long career, as well as making many friends, he made 1 or 2 enemies, and his legacy will no doubt revolve around the question of whether or not he was a net force for good in British and wider Western society. Well, I'm joined now by my panel, contributing editor to Novara Media, Michael Walker, and the former Liz Truss advisor and Telegraph journalist, Asa Bennett. I think Rupert Murdoch was an enormously good thing, that in terms of the expansion of journalism we got post-Wapping and the courage he had in starting Sky News, which has given an enormous amount of choice to people, he has actually helped the British people have more freedom in their lives and more entertainment in their lives. And I think this has been admirable. Michael?
Clearly he's a very intelligent and impressive man with a very impressive career. I would say his net effect has been bad for a couple of reasons. I suppose fundamentally, I think it was Fox News especially, and others of his outlets, the Australian ones especially, which really encouraged governments to drag their feet or drag their heels when it came to tackling climate change. It would have been much cheaper if, when we were told about climate change by Al Gore and the like in the early noughties, we'd had governments do something about it then than waiting until now. One of the reasons that didn't happen is because he decided that it was he would launch this campaign to sow doubt where there didn't need to be any. They now accept that climate change exists, and now they just want us to go a bit more slowly. But they haven't apologised for getting it wrong for the past 20 years. Also on democracy, the Fox News is in trouble at the moment. They had to pay £800 million to a company that builds voting stations because they told what they knew was a lie about the election being stolen from Donald Trump. So I get the impression of a company which is very willing to lie and tends to lie in the interests of the billionaire class. And I think that has been very damaging for ordinary people.
So what are your thoughts? As I say, I think Rupert has been a huge source of good in the world, that he's been on the side of the people, against the international elite. And that's been very powerfully expressed through his newspapers, particularly, obviously, The Sun.
Well, absolutely. We have to remember where he started, just with a couple of newspapers in Australia, very much going against the establishment grain, and then he becomes, chair and head of one of the biggest media empires in recent history. And with that, there's always been that desire to try and push new boundaries. He was pioneer in broadcasting, effectively was the grandfather of GB News, because, Sky News and everything else that flows from there. He ventured into new frontiers in the digital world, acquiring MySpace, and he was always trying to test and see what more he could do. Above all, though, he was a businessman. So yes, Michael and others will then debate, what interested him, what were the machinations behind his dealings with politicians. Fundamentally, it was what was good for business. As we know from various newspapers like The Sun, when Tony Blair was popular in his pomp, they were behind Blair. When, and very much they were the barometer of, what their readers were thinking. They were symbiotic in a relationship and closeness to the people, because obviously they have to stand up for them. They have to speak truth to power, and that's what he did through and through.
And Michael, isn't that an important part of the point, that his newspapers actually reflected what the readers thought and magnified it, rather than telling the readers what to think?
Well, I suppose if that were the case, why did Tony Blair think it was so essential for him to go and visit Rupert Murdoch on a yacht to try and guarantee the support for New Labour from Rupert Murdoch? I mean, The Sun infamously had a front page saying it was The Sun what won it in 1992, because the Labour opposition at that point in time wanted to raise taxes. So Tony Blair had to go to the yacht, say, "Don't worry, I'm not going to do anything to upset you and your business, your billionaire friends. We're safe." And then The Sun endorses New Labour. To me, that's not particularly democratic, that you have to go beg to a billionaire on a yacht.
All prime ministers have a relationship with journalists and with proprietors of newspapers, and that goes back for a very long time.
The problem, I think, is how much power is concentrated in one person's hands, and also where that person got their power from. So if their power comes from, obviously, Rupert Murdoch, very successful. He had some business acumen. I think, in a way, the sort of profit-maximising nature of it has... we've seen the limits of it, especially when it comes to Trump, right? So they knew that the election wasn't stolen. They had to pretend it was stolen because they were worried that the audience they had built would reject them if they told them the truth. So being driven only by the bottom line, I don't think is always a good thing.
And it's not surprising, I don't really agree with that, because I think what he did, by showing that newspapers and TV stations could be profitable, was widen the market. I don't think The Independent could have come into existence if he hadn't defeated the unions at Wapping, and that's one of the most important changes in union relationships in the 1980s.
Well, because one of the things he grasped was that the only guarantor of independence is profit, sustainability. That's why these papers are among the best-selling in the country, and it comes back to that point that he would know which way his readers were thinking, what they wanted most, and that's why he'd amplify the issues. That's why you had things like the Sun newspaper would always go on about fuel duty and hard-pressed drivers, and really making sure to hold ministers' feet to the fire, as I'm sure you know from your previous experience. And it's one in the same breath that he'd also cross-subsidise. So there'll be papers like The Times that I think very much owed their survival to The Sun and others, making sure to sort of get the customers in. Anyway, he basically then increased media plurality and was able to enrich the discourse, at least in Britain.
Because it's allowed for the left to have their platforms as well, that he opened up the whole media market and really broke down monopolistic behaviour.
Well, I mean, many of the rules he got changed were to allow market concentration, were to allow one person to own many, many outlets. So I don't really think he was sort of a leader when it came to competition. He wanted one person to be able to own all of these different outlets. I mean, in Australia, he owns 2/3 of the media, right? I think it's very difficult to say that it's healthy for one unelected person to wield that much political power, which he absolutely did.
But don't you think that power's enormously exaggerated? That in 1997, the Sun backed New Labour because New Labour was going to win, and that's what Sun readers wanted the Sun to do. It wasn't because Rupert Murdoch had said, "I want Tony Blair to win."
I actually don't think that's true. And I mean, obviously, I have more intimate knowledge of the opposition now and Keir Starmer. And we often discuss on our show on Novara, why is Keir Starmer, when it's popular to tax the rich, not saying he will tax the rich? Why, for example, is he saying we might have closer alignment with the EU, but that we won't tax the rich? Now, among Red Wall voters, I think taxing the rich is more popular than closer alignment with the EU. Who is he worried about upsetting? He's worried about upsetting big billionaire media barons. He wants them to be on side. He wants to say, I am a safe pair of hands if you're wealthy. That's what Tony Blair also had to do. That's why he had to guarantee that he would not raise tax.
All right, well, I'm a great fan of Rupert Murdoch's. My father was offered the chance to go into business with him when he was up at Oxford to invest in a student newspaper, and he didn't do it, I think to his business regret, for many years afterwards. Anyway, thank you very much to my panel. After the break, I'll be asking them, is being British good for your mental health? Oh, and then I'll be asking William Sitwell if there's anything worse than a bourgeois pilferer.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hi there. Thursday's blustery showers will ease overnight, some drier and clearer spells, but also a cool night to come with temperatures widely in the single figures before further showers on Friday. Now, we've lost the persistent spells of rain that we saw earlier in the week, especially across western parts of the UK, but we've still got quite a number of showers circulating around an old area of low pressure that's sitting to the north of Scotland, and that means there will be further showers overnight, especially for western Scotland, Northern Ireland, western parts of England and Wales, and there'll be some showers or even some thunderstorms just running through the channel close to Kent at times overnight. But inland, actually plenty of clear spells, and under those clear spells with light winds, temperatures falling into the mid to high single figures or even the low single figures for northern parts of the UK. So a fresh start on Friday, but a bright start for many. Decent spells of sunshine across the Midlands into eastern England for a time. The bulk of the showers during the morning will be in the west. They'll move east, the odd rumble of thunder in eastern England by the afternoon. And it's a cool day compared with what we've experienced so far in September. That leads us on to a frosty start in places on Saturday. Touch of frost mid-Wales northwards in sheltered spots, but actually plenty of sunshine. And it's looking like a fair day for the vast majority. The cloud will build into the afternoon, but decent dry and bright weather lingers on. That is until Sunday, when persistent rain returns to the west, a bit warmer in the south and east.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton, for 2 hours packed full of unfiltered opinions, unique takes and fiery debates. I guarantee you blockbuster guests and exclusive reporting with no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly.
And no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling
the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Arthur, the tabloid press that Murdoch helped to develop has become a beast out of control. We need to be working to limit the influence of the media. And I'm afraid, Arthur, I don't agree with you at all. It's freedom of speech. Sarah, I have huge respect for what Murdoch created. You don't see many businessmen like him these days. Well, it was the first Duke of Wellington, Prime Minister in the 1820s and 30s, who took a great disinclination for, as he put it, assuaging what gentlemen call their feelings. It was this Stoicism known as the Great British Stiff Upper Lip that guided us to glory at the peaks of our empire and through the darkest days huddled in air raid shelters in the Second World War. No complaints, no entitlement, just keeping calm and carrying on. If you go back to Waterloo, there's the wonderful story of Lord Anglesey, who is next to the Duke of Wellington, and his leg gets shot off. And he says, "Gad, sir, I've lost my leg." To which the Duke of Wellington replied, the two didn't get on. "Gad, sir, so you have." Lord Raglan, at the same battle, has his arm amputated. And they were very quick at amputations in those days, because if they were slow, your chance of not surviving was very high. And as his arm was cut off and thrown into the pile of other limbs, Lord Raglan said, "Oi, there's a very valuable ring on one of my fingers. Can I have it back, please?" That's the sort of stiff upper lip that I admire hugely. But it wasn't much later, it was into the 20th century, when psychoanalysts came in, and Sigmund Freud and others foisted upon the Western world this idea of indulging our feelings, analysing them and sharing them. And for quite a while now, this has been the orthodoxy of the psychoanalytic field. But a new study conducted by Cambridge University, in which participants were told to suppress their negative thoughts and feelings, may have smashed the Freudian orthodoxy, as it has suggested this method helped placate the patient's anxiety. So did the British have it right all along with the stiff upper lip? Well, I'm now joined by Dr. Zulkeda Mamat, one of the authors of the study. Thank you so much for joining us. So your study has found that applying a bit of starch to your upper lip is exactly what you need to do.
Yes, in certain circumstances, definitely so. And thank you so much for giving this time to speak about the research.
Well, no, thank you for coming on. How many people were involved in the study, and how did you try and test this to see whether perseverance and fortitude was more helpful than indulging their feelings?
Yes, so there were in total over 120 participants, but at the end, the full data set included 120 participants. And what the data shows is that in these circumstances, which was during the pandemic, actually it's much more beneficial to suppress. And when we say suppress, we don't mean avoid. So it's actually to suppress in the way of completely blanking your mind and really focusing your attention to try to not think of anything at all. So that type of suppression where you are actually taking control of your thoughts can be very, very helpful for your mental health.
So it's about taking control of your own emotions and saying, actually, I'm going to deal with this, I'm not going to dwell on it, I'm going to get on with life and see what happens next. What implications does this have for psychoanalysis and treatment of people who may need help in their lives?
So we definitely would hope for this to be an alternative, to be offered as an alternative and or even a complementary therapeutic approach. We don't mean to necessarily completely say, you know, that the current methodology is absolutely wrong, definitely not. But for those who are not taking any benefit or is resisting to treatment of, you know, talk therapy or other forms of therapy, then perhaps this is, you know, an ability that you can harness within yourself. And if you learned how to do this, you can employ it at any point in your life. And so just like any cognitive skill, you can train it.
Well, this sounds to me to be very important work. Do you plan to do other studies to try and reinforce the conclusions you've come to, or are other universities going to be following in your footsteps?
Certainly so. We are already starting to work on this with an app, so we're trying to make it more accessible for people. Definitely the next step would be to try this in the clinical population to try to see if we can teach people who really struggle, those who really need it the most, which we're already seeing a bit of that in our current study. And so those are the next steps. And so I'll be involved here and there, but hopefully more researchers will take this on and move this forward.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mahmoud. It's very reassuring research, so grateful you've come on to explain it to us. Well, my panel is still with me, contributing editor to Novara Media, Michael Walker, and the former Liz Truss advisor and Telegraph journalist, Asa Bennett. Asa, this is wonderful, isn't it, for people who believe in the traditional virtues of the British?
Splendid. It's a vindication for the best of British. And we know this since the classical philosophers, the Stoics, like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca. They often talk about the idea that you effectively just need to worry about what you can control. And don't worry about everything else, because your fate will take its course and you can just be more sanguine as a result and, not have to, as it were, wallow in your feelings. Of course, I should add as a disclaimer, for some people, talking does help, and these sort of therapies are very much have their place. But I think this certainly does speak to the idea that if you do want to steel yourself, then it can be a very useful discipline. Obviously, this is the way to have self-control, self-reliance, and ultimately independence.
Oh, Michael, the left is like it will hang out, don't
well,
they?
I'm somewhat distracted by your opening monologue about chopping off arms without anaesthetic. I'm worried that that's going to be the Tories' electoral campaign. Don't worry about 12-hour waits in A&E. It's good for you to just cut off your arms and deal with it.
But I will tell you about Nelson, when he had his arm cut off, he gave one instruction afterwards, which was that the knife in future should be warm rather than cold, because he'd found the cold knife very uncomfortable.
I think we should keep giving people anaesthetic.
We now have them. We didn't then.
Well, you just have to wait a long time to get it now. That's the difference. I suppose on this, the expert speaking there, it doesn't sound like they're saying, just stiff upper lip, get on with it. It sounds a bit more like cognitive behavioural therapy. So I think when you go into therapy, there are sort of two streams that are often complementary to each other. One is talking therapy, where you talk about what might be the roots of your distress. Where is this coming from? And the other is cognitive behavioural therapy, where we say, what strategies can you use to try and ignore the worst things and sort of emphasise the good things? And it seems more... I'm not that sure what the sort of innovation is here.
But isn't that something that then we can all do? And that therefore, instead of feeling, if people are a little bit gloomy about the gills, that they need to go off and talk to somebody and say, well, actually, I'm just going to cheer up and crack on?
Well, I think probably an ability to do both would probably be the best. It's also difficult to know. I know some people who, really don't want to do therapy, for example, and so do suppress a lot of stuff, and that can have very negative consequences.
But it's a complete change, isn't it? We've been reading for years that people should express their feelings more, that men should cry more, all this sort of stuff, which is awful guff, isn't it?
I don't think that's guff. I think that's actually one way to live a richer life. I suppose you can look at this. Should we feel... And a lot of this is about, should you welcome someone being open or should you condemn them? And should you feel shame for being vulnerable? I think if we're going back to a period where people felt shame for being vulnerable, that would be a mistake. The ability to be able to ignore the bad... Fantastic, but it's an ability, not a demand we should make of people.
I don't want to condemn anybody. They can behave as they wish within reason. But I think saying to people, actually, just getting on with things will give you more control over your life is self-evidently true and sensible.
Well, if people followed that, you wouldn't have spectacles like the Jeremy Kyle show, where people effectively were sort of airing their dirty laundry, relitigating for the public arena and for entertainment, all sorts of issues. They would instead be wanting to resolve things in private, be more sort of discreet. That sounds like a bit of a sort of a bit catty, granted of me, but my point is more that, there is, and you're right to touch on this, then an aspect of modern society where people then are encouraged just to sort of, say anything on their mind. All feelings are valid, all opinions, must be heard, sort of thing. And yet, the end result is, you can often sort of drag yourself into the mire somewhat. Sort of the misery memoirs and all the rest of it. It's so that in some ways, yes, CBT, I completely agree that these are all interesting means to ultimately the end of trying to then pull yourself up, get yourself, driving forwards to happier days.
And there's the risk that it becomes self-indulgent if you're just talking about yourself the whole time. And that's why you need to get away from the self-indulgence to a sort of strong approach to taking charge.
Potentially. I mean, I suppose my concern here is that this is sort of reinforcing people who want to be more dismissive of people who want to discuss their emotions and the struggles they might have. And I think probably one of the more positive developments that we've had in recent decades is that, especially for men, it is now more acceptable and more accepted for people to say, "Oh, I'm struggling in this way."
But has that done them any good? I mean, isn't that the point, that this actually harmed them and made their lives more difficult? And we've had quite a rise, I think, in male suicide.
Well, so I suppose you've got to look at sort of multi-factors that might have led to that. So I would say if you're looking at young people, for example, and suicides, which are incredibly worrying at the moment, I would say that probably has more to do with social media. And if people weren't encouraged to then talk about their emotions, it could be even worse. So I would say there are probably other external or separate factors in society that are leading to people to have worse mental health. And thank God people now feel a bit more comfortable talking about it.
Mason?
Well, I thoroughly agree on that point, you know, but because at the very least, coming back to the principal, you know, theme of the study, I mean, certainly it does, you know, it provides some encouragement to the general sort of thesis that you're pushing, or that, you know, obviously if you try and be a sort of misery guts and sort of think too much about the bad, obviously you won't be able to move on.
And that we do have a terrible problem in society with an increase in mental health problems.
Yes.
And I just wonder whether that's been because people have been taking this approach that you need to let your emotions hang out, rather than thinking you can take control. And taking control is really helpful for people in getting on with their lives. And this may be your opening point, that there's a role for both.
Well, so I think there is an element of truth that potentially part of our culture has discouraged people to be resilient. So sort of the idea that you say, this is harmful, that's harmful, I'm feeling attacked, that is now sort of celebrated as part of conversation. I think actually maybe you should get over that. Maybe you should be a bit more resilient. Does make sense. But at the same time, we should not be discouraging people from being open about how they feel.
We don't all have to be like Lord Raglan if we have an arm chopped off. Thank you to my panel. Coming up, we'll be leading the crusade against the bourgeois pilferers.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by headliners on TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. Just in case you doubted, I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Maggie says, in the very early 20th century, my granddad, who was a Yorkshire miner, was walking to work one morning when he was hit by a bus. He made sure he found his lunchbox and hurried to the pit in case he was late for his shift. A real stiff upper lip. Absolutely splendid. And John says, I've always thought that if you see a psychiatrist, they will find mental problems no matter what. After all, that's what they're trained to do, Jacob. Well, I should try and make sure I don't see one. Thank you. It seems shoplifting is the next epidemic on the agenda for Britain, and it's hard to think of a time when it was quite so rampant across the country. Supermarkets are placing security tags on food items, concept unthinkable even a few years ago, and it illustrates the consequences of a decline in trust in society. But it appears a number of bourgeois pilferers and purloiners are confessing to taking part in a criminal epidemic too. Indeed, they're rather showing off about it, which I think is particularly disagreeable. There have been a number of anonymous newspaper pieces in the Times about how scoundrels have been scanning items through the self-checkout services, pretending avocados are actually apples or pears, or stealing extra packets of soy sauce and pickled ginger, quite disgusting things anyway, from sushi restaurants. Well, the cost of living crisis is no excuse for breaking the law, and frankly, most of the broader problems are a result of organised crime rather than starving individuals. There is something particularly unpleasant and disturbing about well-to-do, affluent people doing this and stealing from poorer consumers who are law-abiding, because they have to pay increased prices to make up for the loss through pilfering. And although they say they only steal from large established supermarkets, that's no good at all. The big supermarkets account for shoplifting by increasing their prices on you, the honest consumer. So I think these people should be deeply ashamed of themselves, and the newspapers that print these anonymous stories should report those journalists to the police, and they should have their collars felt. Anyway, I'm now joined by our great expert food correspondent, William Sitwell. Does this annoy you as much as it does me? I think it really is just such dreadful behaviour.
It was a fascinating piece in the Times, and I thought one of the most extraordinary quotes was one of the writers talking about how they are proud to administer restorative justice as a sort of campaign against sloppy service. It makes me think, pushing my trolley through Waitrose, whether I'm the only person who's actually, paying for stuff. I mean, what I find surprising is I remember a few years ago, and Waitrose was a client of mine for about 20 years. I produced a magazine for them. And when they introduced this thing called Quick Check, which is where with a gun, you can shop for yourself, and it's for you to be sort of honest or dishonest. And I remember speaking to the MD at the time, Mark Price, and I said, are you seeing an increase in shoplifting? And he said, well, no, because Waitrose shoppers are so honest that actually they're overcompensating rather than the other way around. But I think, the idea of this sort of, stealing in plain sight, I suppose it's been something that's been simmering for years. People go to hotels and they pinch the towels. Some people, rather like me, take rather too many of the, the condiments, the shampoos and the conditioners and the creams and so on. Obviously, it's a more intelligent way of pilfering rather than ransacking a store, even with a hoodie on.
But it's just as wrong, isn't it? And this idea that it's restorative justice, actually, if you get bad service in a shop or in a restaurant and you say politely to the manager something's gone wrong, usually they'll do something about it anyway. You don't need to steal to take the law into your own hands to put things right.
You don't, but I think some people feel that being a vigilante is more satisfying, and the fact that it's secret.
Don't you think it just gives them some moral defence as to what they're doing? They actually know what they're doing is deeply shabby.
They know what they're doing, but I think it's not about coping with the cost of living crisis. I actually think it's more of a psychological issue, and there have been, Anthony Warren Thompson was famously busted for stealing cheese, I think it was from Tesco a few years ago. And he admitted this. He said it was part of a sort of mental breakdown that he was having. And I think it is more indicative as to a sort of specific mental health issue because, if you're Itsu pinching an extra set of chopsticks or a bit of ginger.
It's just a weird thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah, you're not really stealing because you're not enriching yourself. Certainly not mentally, but you're not actually going to be better off as a result of it. So, in terms of criminality, it's fairly, far down the pecking order.
But taking a towel from a hotel, that is just straightforward theft.
It is theft, and actually most hotels are pretty sharp on it these days. And actually they say if you want to take the bathing robes, they cost X.
Yes.
And, but I mean, you might remember people used to steal ashtrays from restaurants before they banned smoking. And I remember speaking to a restaurateur on the King's Road once who said that, those new sort of molten brown dispensers for soap they put on the walls, and he once busted someone going into the restaurant with an Allen key so they could take the soap off.
There's an amazing company I visited in my constituency that makes the contraptions that hold the soap, and they export them all around the world because people are so determined to pinch soap from British Airways first-class lounges, hotels. Absolutely extraordinary. But these people don't think they're thieving. They think they're above that.
But what you find is the clever restaurateurs, the clever people behind brands, have sort of surreptitiously encouraged it, because if you had a smart Conran ashtray at your house, you were marketing Conran. You may remember that in Virgin Upper Class, Richard Branson introduced a salt and a pepper pot, and on the bottom of it, it said pinched from Virgin because he knew people would steal it.
Very briefly, the state banquet in France, the King was there, the President of France, not allowed any foie gras or oysters. Putting your restaurateur expert hat on, do you think that was a good thing?
Well, listen, what I read is that the King asked for foie gras to be taken off the menu for ethical reasons, and he's a great champion of all these sorts of things and sustainability and ethical consumers and so on. It would have obviously upset you because I think it's about the only thing you can eat is foie gras.
Yes,
Oysters I'm surprised about. Maybe it's just because he or maybe the Queen have had a bad one. I mean, there's nothing unethical. There's no debate at all. Foie gras, it is a very, tricky subject, and I think it's something that the King does not need to get into.
All right. Well, what annoys a noisy oyster most? Annoys a noisy oyster most. On that happy note, thank you very much, William. That's all from me. Up next, it's our great professor, Daniel Wootton. Daniel, what's on the menu this evening? Any foie gras?
Good evening, Jacob. No, although I would quite like some, if I'm completely honest. But no, we are sticking with Nut Zero, all of the fallout. But we're going to have some fun tonight because it is a Thursday, and we're discussing whether this term Karen is discriminatory. Julie Birchall says women have to reclaim the term Karen. We've got Kim Woodburn up against Joanna Jaju. I have a feeling it's going to kick off.
That sounds extremely interesting, and good debate on whether Karen is something that people should say or shouldn't say at all. It should be polite to people called Karen. That's coming up after the weather. I will be back on Monday at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation. I will be driving down to Somerset immediately this programme ends, and I'm looking forward to the weather there tomorrow being clement weather extraordinaire.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hi there. Thursday's blustery showers will ease overnight. Some drier and clearer spells, but also a cool night to come with temperatures widely in the single figures before further showers on Friday. Now, we've lost the persistent spells of rain that we saw earlier in the week, especially across western parts of the UK. But we've still got quite a number of showers circulating around an old area of low pressure that's sitting to the north of Scotland. And that means there will be further showers overnight, especially for western Scotland, Northern Ireland, western parts of England and Wales. And there'll be some showers or even some thunderstorms just running through the channel close to Kent at times overnight. But inland, actually plenty of clear spells, and under those clear spells with light winds, temperatures falling into the mid to high single figures or even the low single figures for northern parts of the UK. So a fresh start on Friday, but a bright start for many. Decent spells of sunshine across the Midlands into eastern England for a time. The bulk of the showers during the morning will be in the west. They'll move east. The odd rumble of thunder in eastern England by the afternoon. And it's a cool day compared with what we've experienced so far in September. That leads us on to a frosty start in places on Saturday.